few grains caught between two fingers, tipped over a plate. You barely watch it fall. It disappears into the food before you've thought about it at all. Nothing about that gesture feels like history. It feels like nothing. A reflex, a habit, something your hand does without asking your brain for permission. But somewhere behind your eyes, a cluster of neurons smaller than almost anything else in your brain just fired. Not because you're hungry, not because the food needs it, because something ancient in your body has been waiting for longer than your species has existed for exactly this. The question of when humans first started using salt sounds like it should have a simple answer. A mine, a date, a first pinch on a first tongue. It doesn't. And the real story is stranger than a first taste, because the craving arrived long before salt was ever something you could hold. Picture an animal that isn't human at all. Any mammal, at almost any point in the last 100 million years, living inland, away from the sea, eating mostly plants. Plants don't carry much sodium. Blood does. Nerves do. Muscles do. An animal that runs low on it doesn't get a headache. It gets a body that stops working correctly, a heart that can't regulate itself, a brain that can't fire its own signals properly. Sodium isn't a flavor preference. It's closer to a hinge the whole nervous system swings on. This is not a small problem to solve. In a world with no mines, no trade routes, no guarantee that today's meal contains any sodium at all, the difference between an animal that can detect and chase down scarce salt and one that can't is the difference between a body that keeps functioning and one that doesn't. Modern neuroscience has actually found the switch. Researchers studying mice identified a strikingly small cluster of neurons in the brainstem, something like 200 cells in a mouse, roughly 1,000 in a human, that appear to control almost nothing except the drive to seek out and consume sodium. When the body runs low, a hormone called aldosterone activates these cells, and the animal's behavior changes almost instantly. It will voraciously drink salt solutions concentrated enough to be aversive to a healthy animal. Scientists studying this pathway have called it one of the most tightly, specifically wired behaviors found anywhere in the mammalian brain. An instinct depending on a population of cells you could almost count by hand. And critically, this response doesn't have to be learned. An animal that has never once experienced sodium deficiency in its life will still, the first time its body runs low, know exactly what it's looking for. That's the puzzle sitting underneath your salt shaker. A skeleton can't tell you an ancient animal's cravings directly, but neurobiology can tell you, with real precision, that the craving didn't start with a person. It's older than primates. It's older than mammals choosing fruit over nuts. It's something closer to a survival circuit that evolution built once, kept, and handed down largely unchanged through millions of years into a small population of cells sitting in your own brainstem right now. Here's where it gets genuinely counterintuitive. We tend to picture ancient salt use as something almost incidental. Animals licking a mineral outcrop, humans stumbling onto a salty spring. The evidence says something closer to the reverse. Long before salt was gathered or produced, an intense, specific, involuntary hunger for it was already built into the body doing the gathering. The craving isn't a habit layered on top of a body that didn't need it. It's one of the oldest, most protected instincts that body has. None of this means early humans were casually salting their food the way you do. Sodium in the wild is scarce and scattered. A salt lick, a mineral spring, the blood and organ meat of prey animals, which is where many early diets likely got most of their sodium at all. An animal or early human with a sharp drive towards salt had a real edge, provided it could find a source often enough to matter. That pressure didn't disappear when humans began settling into permanent communities. It changed shape entirely, because settling down made the problem worse, not better. A hunter eating fresh meat gets meaningful sodium built into that meat. A farmer eating mostly grain does not. As populations across the ancient world shifted toward agriculture, they were, without fully realizing it, moving away from their most reliable natural sodium source and toward diets that made deliberate salt gathering not just useful, but necessary. Nowhere is that shift more visible than at a site in what's now northeastern Bulgaria, near the modern town of Provadia. Archaeologists there have uncovered what's currently considered the oldest known salt production center in Europe. A settlement where, starting somewhere around 5,600 to 5,400 BCE, people boiled brine from natural salt springs inside thin-walled ceramic pots set into massive clay ovens, driving off the water and leaving solid salt behind. This wasn't a side activity. The settlement built stone fortification walls around itself, generation after generation, to protect what it was producing. Nearby burial sites show a level of accumulated wealth unusual for the period. Researchers studying the site now describe those salt blocks as functioning like an early form of currency, one of the first materials in prehistoric Europe valuable and portable enough to be traded, hoarded, and defended. Salt, in other words, wasn't just seasoning. In the right place at the right time in prehistory, it was closer to money with a use-by function nobody ever needed to renew. That pattern, salt as currency, salt as power, didn't stay confined to one Bulgarian valley. It shows up again and again across the ancient world in different clothes. Chinese sources describe salt production and taxation as a state concern for thousands of years, tightly controlled because whoever controlled the salt supply controlled something no population could simply choose to live without. Trans-Saharan trade routes moved slabs of rock salt from mines deep in the desert south into West Africa, trading it in some periods for its weight in gold, because settlements far from any coast or mineral deposit had no other reliable way to get it. And this is where the most famous salt story of all comes in. The one that's probably crossed your feed at some point in some form. You've likely heard some version of it, that the word salary comes from Roman soldiers being paid in salt, that a soldier who wasn't performing well wasn't worth his salt. It's one of the most repeated word origin claims in popular history. Here's the myth bust. Modern etymologists who've gone back through the actual Latin sources have found no solid ancient evidence that Roman soldiers were ever literally handed rations of salt as payment. What did exist was something more mundane, a salarium, a cash stipend that soldiers likely used, among other things, to buy salt for preserving and seasoning their food. Over time, that word for the allowance connected to salt simply became the general word for a soldier's pay, and eventually, salary. The literal image, a legionary handed a sack of salt instead of coins, appears to be a much later invention, first showing up in reference works centuries after Rome fell, then repeated so often it hardened into common knowledge. What's interesting is that the myth didn't need to be true to be revealing. People wanted to believe soldiers were paid in salt, because on some level it felt right. Because salt really had been valuable enough, scarce enough, fought over enough, across enough of human history, that the idea of paying someone in it wasn't absurd. The myth is wrong. The instinct behind why people believed it wasn't. For most of human history, that's what salt was. Rare enough to be worth mining, taxing, fighting over, defending with stone walls. In France, centuries later, an entire state salt tax, the gabelle, became so resented by ordinary people that it stood among the grievances feeding the unrest that led into the French Revolution. A seasoning, taxed into a symbol of everything wrong with the government, That scarcity is the piece almost entirely missing from how we think about salt today. And it's the hinge the story turns on, because at some point, salt stopped being something you mined, taxed, and revolted over, and became something you keep in a shaker on the table, refilled without a second thought. Industrial mining and processing did to salt roughly what industrial refining did to sugar a few centuries later. Took something that once required real labor, real risk, real infrastructure to obtain, and made it functionally infinite. Cheap, iodized, sitting in a container designed to dispense it a pinch at a time, precisely because nobody making that container imagined scarcity would ever be the problem again. Your body was never built for that supply. It was built for a world where sodium meant a lucky mineral spring, or a hard-won trade good, worth walking toward, worth defending, worth building a fortress around. The craving is ancient. The abundance is not. Which brings you back to the plate in front of you. A pinch, forgettable, dissolving before you've thought about it. It isn't asking anything difficult of you. It doesn't need you to find a spring or trade for a slab hauled across a desert. It just needs you to reach for it, the way something in your brainstem has been built to do since long before there were shakers, before there were fortresses, before there were humans to build either one. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that's something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.